Hello everyone, this is going to be a review video dealing with the period between the First World War and the Second World War. It is known as the Interwar period. It encompasses a couple of different topics. For starters, it's going to deal with kind of the first Red Scare, the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, and ultimately the rise of FDR and his New Deal. It took place between 1918 and 1939. The first topic here is going to be dealing with what's called the First Red Scare. And the First Red Scare is a period, as I said here, marked by a widespread fear of Bolshevism, which is just another word for communism. If you remember, the Bolsheviks were the ones who took over in Russia after the Communist Revolution. You have anarchism, and then ultimately due to real and imagined events. So the real events that I'm kind of talking about is, as I just said, the Russian Revolution, right? If you remember from your world history, hopefully, that basically you have this group who comes to power in Russia, these communists, these Bolsheviks, who really have publicly stated that the goal of communism and the communist revolution in general is to foster this worldwide revolution. So what happens is, with the rise of the labor movement and anarchism and things like that in the United States, you ultimately get this period of fear as a result of these things, based by the people in some cases in charge, but also from the American community as a whole. Thing that I think is really important to kind of highlight is just how closely related sometimes the ideals of the labor movement, socialism, and communism can actually be. I think it's really important to understand it. I think this poster that I have here, in this political cartoon, kind of highlights that. It basically talks about this step-by-step, of the labor movement, leading into strikes and ultimately disorder and then Bolshevism, and it kind of is a negative connotation, obviously, looking here, but what happens is that as you get these different, these nationwide strikes occurring, around the country in the late 1800s and even in the early 1900s here, you're going to have nationwide strikes in the coal industry, the steel industry, and even in the police department in Boston, in the late 1910s. And what happens is, these strikes are looked down upon by, obviously, many of the people in charge of the country, in these business interests in particular, and they basically want to associate the labor movement here with the negative connotations that you experience when talking about communism and even socialism and anarchism as well. So by linking up these labor movement strikes and things like that, and the ideas behind all of these, and as I said, they are often closely related ideals. The certain community in America, in particular, the large business interests and thing, wanted to demonize the labor movement because they didn't want these progressive changes occurring in the country, because ultimately it hurt their bottom dollar and their influence over things. The Red Scare really becomes a thing when you have this wave of anarchist bombings that take place in the United States. The first wave is actually in April 1919, and there is a number of bombs that were actually sent via mail by anarchists. We don't know who these people necessarily were, but we do know that these bombs were actually intended for prominent American politicians. And one thing that's also important to note is that these bombs didn't actually reach their targets, but it doesn't mean that this isn't obviously frightening for these people in charge, and also doesn't mean it's not scary. So you have this fear over this anarchism, and ultimately it's linked to this idea, of the communist revolt and revolution that's going on elsewhere in the world. And when you get a second wave of these bombings that actually target some of the same people, in particular, the Attorney General named Mitchell Palmer, and actually almost blows up his house. It does blow up part of his house. They ultimately start investigating these radicals looking for the people responsible for these type of things. Obviously, you can look at this political cartoon here, and much of this anarchism and even socialism and communist groups that existed in the country, many of them were coming from abroad and coming from Europe in these waves of immigration that had happened in the late 1800s and even early 1900s. And this cartoon, I think, really says it best, in some of the fear that they're trying to instill here with this European anarchist, holding a knife and holding this bomb that's going to basically go and blow up the Statue of Liberty. So with these waves of bombings and almost bombings that took place, on these high-ranking U.S. officials, including the Attorney General Mitchell Palmer, you actually are going to get this kind of push by Congress for the Attorney General to begin cracking down and finding and rooting out these suspected radicals so that things like this won't continue to happen. And that's kind of what happens. So with that push by Congress, you get Palmer okaying and leading and spearheading these raids that are become known as the Palmer raids, where he directs local officials and federal agents to kind of round up these large groups, of many cases, suspected radicals. And he's going to work with a young J. Edgar Hoover, who's going to kind of bring in his expertise and helping with warrantless wiretappings that had been okayed by the Sedition Act, and having agents kind of infiltrate these groups and help name names and things like that. The real sad thing about this is that many of the people that were actually rounded up, in many cases, had never taken any radical action in their lives, and the reason why that they were rounded up and suspected in the first place was simply just by association or membership in one of these political groups in the Socialist Party of America or the Communist Party of America or things like that, and union membership even as well. And what happens is that this is actually a bit of a stain on American history, really, because you get this crackdown on these civil liberties and these people being rounded up and in some cases actually being deported, when in reality they had nothing to do with any of the anarchism that was going on. And most of these deportations were actually limited because it was figured out and realized that most of these people were not involved again at all. I think this really just goes to show how much of an effect, this type of fear and xenophobia can actually have on the policy of a country. And I think it's really important to understand that this was heavily supported in most cases by the American public, and you're obviously going to have some dissenting opinions to it, and some people saying that this is not, okay, but for the most part, many people are going to agree with it because of the fear that is being instilled, based off of the communist revolution going on and the Bolshevism, and the fear that that's going to actually spread to America through these foreign radicals. Another thing that's going to kind of start taking place in the late 1910s or so is known as the Great Migration. And what's going to happen is that you're going to get a wave of African American migration, in particular from the Deep South. And this is mostly as a result of the discontent that had kind of occurred during the Reconstruction era in the United States. Many of these African Americans really were just not happy with their living situation. They were still being, oppressed with the Jim Crow laws and the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling and things like that. So this really starts during World War I, and if you think about it, what happens is that with many of your men being sent off to war and being drafted, is going to really open up a large demand for more people to fill those roles in the workplace. So the northern industry that was necessary to help make this war happen, and that coinciding with kind of a kind of pullback on immigration policy by the Americans and the amount of people that we actually allow into the country, it's going to really open up the perfect conditions here for the African American community to kind of start taking advantage of these job openings in the North. And that mixed with the discontent of how they were being treated in the South it opens up this kind of flood of about 1.6 million African Americans between 1910 and 1930 working their way into urban centers in the North. This is really the beginning of an urbanization trend of African Americans that's going to really go on all the way, until the 1970s and even 1980s. And you can see by this graph here, the rate in which it declines from the number of African Americans that are actually living in the South. And the places that many of these people ended up, include Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, Detroit, Washington, D.C., and such. So with these people taking many of the jobs of the servicemen who had left, obviously women did as well, as we kind of talked about in our last World War I video, but when these thousands of servicemen are going to actually come home after the war and find that many of the jobs had actually been filled by these African Americans or even other immigrants in certain cases, they're going to be frustrated and angry, and it's going to lead to a lot of tension. And I think in some cases, this tension really is best kind of shown through, in some cases, race riots that occurred. And one in particular took place in Chicago when you have a 17-year-old boy named Eugene Williams who was actually drowned in the Great Lake right there. And what happens is that the story goes, you basically have these dividers on the beach, for segregation, and this group of African Americans who are, swimming and enjoying themselves in the lake, and basically as they end up drifting across this line, the segregation line, and you actually have a white man throw rocks at these people, and one actually strikes this Eugene Williams in the head, and he ends up dying and drowning as a result. And there's a lot of eyewitnesses to this, and what really gets these people even more frustrated is not just the killing, obviously, it's that when the police showed up to investigate, there was really a complete refusal to arrest who the eyewitnesses were pointing to as the responsible party here. And it's going to erupt into kind of a 6-day riot. You're going to have shootings and beatings and even arson, burning down some African American living quarters, basically, and it's really ugly. And this just kind of illustrates that tension that we're talking about. The interwar period wasn't all just this violence and this fear that we were just talking about. In fact, that's really kind of occurring right at the turn of the 1920s after World War I. But the 1920s are really going to kind of change America very much, actually. And there's this quote that I really like that kind of helps explain, a bit about the 1920s. And I think, this quote here that basically says, it marks an era where there was a delighted concern over the things that were exciting but didn't necessarily matter profoundly. And a really good example of this is the case of Charles Lindbergh, who becomes a bit of a celebrity, and in 1927 he is actually going to complete the first solo flight across the Atlantic Ocean in his plane called the Spirit of St. Louis. It's going to, he's going to leave from Long Island and end up in Paris. He's going to become this national hero, and mixed with the rise of sport, in particular baseball and things like that. As I said, these things don't necessarily really matter, but they're exciting to people, and you're going to have a lot of this excitement that takes place during the 1920s. Some of these changes that is going to lead to a lot of this excitement, in particular, is going to deal with women. In 1920, you're actually going to get the 19th Amendment after a really long, hard-fought battle, and women are actually going to get the right to vote. And really, throughout the 1920s, women are going to start to take and hold jobs, outside of the home. And this began really during World War I, when women had to fill the shoes of the men, just like many of the African Americans we were just talking about, in these industrial jobs to help sustain the war effort. But after the war, those jobs are going to be kind of given back to the men, but ultimately there's going to be work for women too, and it's going to be considered women's work. But teaching and office work and clerks and typists and things like that are going to be some of these jobs that women are going to be allowed to do. And on top of that, you're going to really get an increase in the education of women, and the numbers of women going to college are going to drastically increase during this time period as well. And you're going to get this iconic figure that's known as flappers, these women flappers who are this freer, more liberated kind of young woman who gets educated, who works, who likes to have fun, and that's not necessarily held down and tied down by a family and a husband. One thing that is important to understand about flappers, though, in general, is that they were atypical. They were only a really small percentage of women in general, and when it really comes down to it, most are going to still end up getting married, staying in the home as homemakers and mothers, and that these women, who are dressing in these shorter skirts, so these more liberated, educated and such, going out and having fun for themselves, is again, it's a small percentage of the women in this time period. But it does illustrate, this kind of fundamental change in beliefs, and this becoming, obviously more accepted. Another aspect of the 20s, and going back to kind of the excitement that we were just talking about before, is that the rise of mass media and a culture that fixates kind of around the mass media, right? I think we can really show today, how much media can actually affect public attitude and opinion on things, and the rate in which ideas can actually be spread and influence culture. It can be done very rapidly through modern means, and you're going to start to get these modern means a little bit more easily. You're going to have things like the radio, and you're going to have the rise of silent movies and motion pictures, magazines, newspapers are going to really help drive a culture. And when you pair that with the increase in time that's going to basically happen as a result of the fruits of the labor movement, as well as the creation and invention of some labor-saving devices, things like washing machines and dishwashers, people are just going to have more time and fewer working hours to kind of enjoy life. Some of the things that people are going to be using and looking at and participating in to enjoy life with this newfound free time, you're going to have lots of different entertainment options. In particular, you're going to have, as I said, just kind of movies. You're going to have these silent movies. In particular, Charlie Chaplin is going to become huge. We watched The Immigrant in class, but you also have the radio being big, right? You can listen to the news for the first time. You're going to be able to listen to concerts and music and sporting events. It's going to really help basically popularize, the radio's going to help popularize sports in general and sports broadcasts. Comedies, stories, all of these things people would gather around kind of like they do with the TV today in certain cases and listen to as a family in certain cases. And, it's going to help really popularize sports, as I just said, and you're going to start to get the sports stars and the celebrities come as a result of this. You're going to have sports stars like Babe Ruth and other big name baseball players, obviously, for the, as I said, the heroic efforts on the field. You're going to also have just fads. Fads are going to come and go. Fads in particular like dance marathons. Crossword puzzles are actually going to be a big thing during the 1920s. And it just shows, all of these things, again, are really made possible by all of the extra free time that people are going to be enjoying during the 1920s. And I think it's also important to note that not everyone is necessarily able to, benefit from all of these. You still have a lot of people that have to work hard, that are kind of stuck in some crummy situations as far as their industrial jobs and things. But the labor movement had really done, a lot to help these people for sure have more time and get paid better for it and things like that, so they could benefit and enjoy these type of things. So you can see right here just a picture of one of those dance marathons, toward the end. It's just really kind of funny when you look at it because of all these people must have been on their feet for hours and hours at this point, and they're just trying to stand up and stay up, but they're all hunched over, kind of like supporting each other with their weight, waiting for everyone else to finish. It's just kind of one of those funny pictures of one of these things that became a bit of a fad during the 1920s. With the influx of African Americans into the northern communities in particular, you're going to get what is known as the Harlem Renaissance. And you're going to get kind of this unique African American identity and culture beginning to influence the rest of the country, and you're going to have this wave of African American writers, writing about their perils and their plights as African Americans in general. They're writing novels and short stories and poems that are going to really help influence culture. But you're also going to have things like the jazz music become really, really relevant, and it really creates this bit of an interest in African American culture from an interest in a group that had been so long kind of suppressed as a result of slavery and the regulations, during the Reconstruction, in the late 1800s going all the way into the early 1900s. And it's going to really become a source of pride, about being an African American and for being an African American and who they are as a people. The jazz music and the jazz age is going to really help capture the spirit of the era, and it's going to really have roots, from the South. Many of them African American work songs you're going to have as these roots to some of this jazz music. You have some big name stars, people like Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Bessie Smith, and it's going to just ultimately add to that unique African American identity, and in often a kind of a unique African American industry during the 1920s. With people starting to get paid more, and ultimately the rise of credit and the ability to buy things in an installment with installment buying, making basically larger purchases over the course of time, and only giving a certain amount of money in sections, basically in segments, until you pay it all the way off. That mixed with the rise of a more widespread electricity is going to really make household appliances possible. Kind of as I was saying before, you're getting these labor-saving devices and time-saving devices, things like refrigerators and vacuums and fans and stoves, which is wouldn't be possible without electricity. So when you pair both of those things with the fact that you're going to have some more modernized production methods, like assembly lines, kind of creating a higher supply of these goods, and in that case, relatively reduced costs, you're going to get people purchasing these things, in pretty high numbers. And it becomes a thing to actually market these products. You're going to have companies actually very aggressively marketing these products, and in some cases using the lessons of the propaganda that had been used during World War I and how effective it was pushing public opinion. So by marketing it aggressively with magazine articles and magazine advertisements and newspaper advertisements and radio advertisements, it's going to really kind of help push this consumer economy. One of the biggest consumer goods that was available in the 1920s was this mass-produced automobile. The fact that automobiles became affordable because in part mostly by Henry Ford's production methods and production line, and his paying of his workers in many cases wages that would basically allow them to afford the cars that they're actually making, but also obviously everyone else being able to potentially afford these things too. You're going to now have people leaving the city, right? The car makes people mobile. And what's going to happen is that people don't necessarily have to live right near where they work anymore. You can take a car, to get to work. The fact that you don't have to work as many hours anymore as well, it all of a sudden becomes practical to live outside of these urban areas where much of this industry is taking place, and you're going to start to get suburbs kind of becoming a thing, immediately outside of the cities in the first place. And then you're obviously going to have a much bigger suburb boom later on in the 1950s and late 1940s after World War II. But this is going to be a really big influence on the country. And with this, now people leaving the cities, you're going to need to have ways for them to get around outside of the cities, and you're going to have a major increase in the roads and the highways and things for these cars to obviously operate on. And with the roads and the highways, you're actually going to get businesses popping up, along these roads. You're going to need to have gasoline stops to fuel the cars, and you can get restaurants and things built around the gasoline stops. And ultimately, you're going to have these kind of centers, obviously, coming up, along these highways and roads and things. And you're also going to kind of get booms in many of the associated industries, related to the car. So the steel that they're using to make the car, the rubber for the tires, glass, all of those industries are going to get a big spike because of the production of the cars and the demand for the automobile in the 1920s as well. So the 1920s were not completely all great. There was a lot of prosperity that was going around the country for sure, but when it really comes down to it, some areas really hurt pretty badly during the 1920s and just are going to continue to hurt, really badly, throughout the Great Depression and all the way up into World War II. But what happened essentially is that many of these post-war industries, especially in agriculture, that had been propped up by the war production, when the war was over, right, all of a sudden the farmers in the West, in the Midwest, who had been producing, large amounts of food for the Allies in the war effort, all of a sudden that demand falters. And this is really, really going to hurt the farmers in this country. All of a sudden the American agriculture is going to actually have to compete with European imports because the European markets are now going to be able to actually get going again, since the war is really not necessarily being fought over there anymore, obviously, and all of a sudden food prices are going to drop drastically. As a result of that, the income that these farmers are making is going to plummet as well. In many cases, the farmers are actually going to lose their farms, unable to pay, off some of the debt, and it's just not a really good time for, the farmers out in the Midwest and in the breadbasket of the country, and that's going to really help to kind of be one of the contributing factors towards the whole Great Depression in the first place. Another interesting thing that occurs during the 1920s is the rise of what's known as the temperance movement. And what the temperance movement basically does is basically advocating against alcohol, drugs, gambling, and any sources of addiction, because the temperance movement really believed that these things were much of the contributing factors to many of the social problems that were happening in this country. Many of the temperance movement, were women, women who were particularly worried about their husbands, coming home drunk and, beating up on them and things like that. And they're able to actually lead large number of people, even at the federal, governmental level, and they actually get the 18th Amendment passed to the Constitution in 1920, which actually bans the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors in this country. It makes alcohol illegal. And I think it's really funny to look at these two contrasting pictures that I have on the screen here. The first one on the top, the men kind of holding these signs, we want beer, obviously, frustrated about the prohibition. And you also have the one below it with the women who actually, have the sign in contrast to that saying, lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. And the prohibition is an interesting time period in America because people were still drinking, and it's actually going to the fact that alcohol is prohibited is going to lead to the rise of organized crime. You're going to have people, kingpins like Al Capone in Chicago, basically smuggling in and basically making a lot of money off of bootlegging and the selling of illegal liquor, and it's going to really mostly be a pretty failed experiment, and it's actually going to be completely and utterly repealed in 1933 with the 21st Amendment. Another piece of the 1920s puzzle is something that's called nativism. And, thinking back to what we were talking about before with the Great Migration and the large influx of African Americans into the North, and the kind of the anxieties that existed as a result of that, and the tensions that existed, as a result of that, you're actually going to get this nativism, basically speaking out and acting out against immigration and even the African Americans in certain situations, with this belief that native-born Americans are ultimately far superior to foreign-born, and you're going to have the revival of groups such as the KKK during this time period, combating the rise of the African Americans a bit, and also immigration and Catholics and Jews even as well. In many of these cases, it's the other underrepresented groups in America who these nativists felt were really representing un-American values. And it's really interesting to see this picture here on the bottom of this large number of KKK members basically walking down the streets of Washington D.C. with the U.S. Capitol building there in the background. So now we're going to be kind of getting into our second part of this review, really talking about the Great Depression and then ultimately FDR and his New Deal initiatives. During the 1920s, you're going to have kind of a major increase in the stock market. The stock market is going to do very, very well over the course of the decade, and you're going to have really record highs going into the fall of 1929. And much of this is brought about by this idea of buying stocks on margin. And what that really means is that basically investors were able to borrow money from brokers to pay for the stocks. And the brokers actually borrowed money from the banks. So typically, by allowing your smaller investor to get involved in the market, when the stocks go up, essentially everyone is going to benefit from that. And so the buying the stocks on the margin is going to really, contribute to some of the prosperity that's going on in the 1920s for sure. So this is just a good graph that kind of really just illustrates, how much the stock market actually went up during the 1920s. You're going to have a couple blips, here or there, but as a general trend, you're going to, have this very, very steady incline, going all the way up to the crash in the first place. And this is going to make, some people a lot of money. Buying stocks on margin, if you put down 10%, which was, I believe, the number that was required, you could buy buy these stocks with your broker who borrowed the money from the banks. And, with the stocks going up, sometimes it wasn't, uncommon for people to make, a good amount of money, a relatively high percentage yield on their investments. And this is going to all come crashing down when the stock market crashes in October of 1929. You're going to have the big loss on Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, and the market, would have been volatile for, roughly the week before this. But the big crash is on October 29th, and Black Tuesday is not necessarily the distinct cause of the Great Depression. I think it's really important to understand that the market crashing really is just something that's going to exacerbate all of the pre-existing conditions that are around the country, to really help this perfect storm come to fruition, of why all of a sudden the country is going to really, really be in really hard times. And between 1929, and 1932, the economic output of the country, the GDP of the country, is going to drop from about 104 billion to 58 billion. So the amount of money essentially people are going to be getting and working with in throughout the course of a year and this time is going to be really cut almost completely in half, and that's going to just lead to conditions of poverty and people really being hard up. This is a great photograph. This is a man who he looks like he's a big, a decent player on Wall Street. He's got his nice suit, he's got his hat, really nice car, but he obviously looks really, really worried when it really comes down to it. And he has this sign, on the car that basically says, $100 will buy this car. I must have cash. I need the currency. I lost everything on the stock market. And if you think about it, the buying stocks on margin is really a bit of a house of cards, right? That basically it's going to all come crumbling down when the market crashes, because these prices, which had been a bit overly inflated and may have been misrepresentative of how the market actually was. So with people making all of this money and the fact that people are buying all of these things on credit, when the market crashes, all of a sudden the brokers are going to be looking for money from the people who had bought these stocks on margin. You're going to have then the banks looking to the brokers for the money that they had lent the brokers to be able to help buy the stocks on margin, and this is all going to come crashing down, and all of a sudden people are going to be really, really hurting financially, and this is going to contribute to banks actually closing their doors. Before I talk a little bit more about the bank runs, let's kind of just go in and talk about some of what are considered some of the root causes of the Great Depression in the first place. The first point I have here is this idea of an unbalanced economy. The what was happening was that by the end of the 1920s, even though the markets were going up, there were some things that really should have started shedding the light that this time of growth and prosperity might kind of be coming to an end. And one of those things that was occurring was kind of lagging orders on manufactured goods. And really what that means is that by the end of the 1920s, much of the market for a lot of these newly produced goods was shrinking, right? People had bought them. Not as many people need them anymore. So even if you have an overproduction of these items and people just aren't buying them anymore, that's going to obviously lead to a problem. On top of that, you have all of the issues with the farms that we talked about just before, and ultimately you're going to have a serious gap in income inequality. You're going to have roughly 75% of people living in poverty during this time period, and roughly 1% of the nation's population is going to actually control 1/3 of the nation's wealth. So when things get bad, so many people are just going to be hurting even more as a result of that, because they really weren't doing so well in the first place. The next part really here is that the whole credit idea and the credit crisis, right? So borrowed money had in many cases fueled the economy in the 1920s. Installment buying and then buying stocks on margin, being able to buy cars and land in installments and things like that really allowed people to get these things, but when they became hard pressed for the money to pay for it, it obviously became an issue, and some people lost those things, right? They lost their cars, they lost their houses, and they lost their land because people really couldn't make good on their loans. And this often, as I said just before, forced the banks to, many of them actually close their doors. in some cases, the banks really couldn't close their doors fast enough. You're going to actually have what are known as bank runs. You're going to have runs on the banks where people are just trying to get out their deposits, get out their money from the banks to make sure that they actually have it when when things really hit the fan during the Great Depression. And when you get a large number of people actually doing this and taking the money out of the bank, all of a sudden the bank struggles to keep up, and if they don't have enough money on hand to deal out these deposits or have that money in the first place, it becomes a really serious problem. And in some cases, many of these banks actually close and close down for good as a result, and people who didn't necessarily get to the banks to get out money or had put money in the bank and really was waiting things out, they got screwed. All of a sudden they just their life savings or things like this were just disappeared. The money that they had in the bank was just gone, because if you remember, a lot of these banks were private organizations and privately run. They were trying to make money for themselves, obviously, so they were looking out for their own best interests too. And you're going to actually get a New Deal initiative out of this, known as the FDIC, which is basically the federal government actually insuring money in bank accounts so that something like this can really never happen again, to ensure that people actually can have money and that this, again, won't happen to the same extent ever again. By 1932, roughly 25% of Americans were actually out of work, and that's a lot. A quarter of the people actually not having work is a serious problem. Obviously, it makes these people really hard pressed for their living conditions, and they're supporting their families and things. But it's not even just that. A lot of the people that were actually working in a lot of cases were actually underemployed, so they just weren't making as much money as they once had, and it becomes poverty. It creates poverty essentially. And in some cases, people couldn't even just find full-time work. So, in some cases, they would work a day and they'd be chosen, or the next day, they wouldn't be chosen for the work that was required, that was needed for the day by the people that actually could employ people, and it became a problem, and work was just not necessarily consistent for a lot of people. And you're going to actually get a bit of relief. Things like bread lines for the poor are going to become, a thing to help relief to help relieve some of the problems for the poor, to help at least have something to eat, right? And in some cases, people would wait hours just to receive small rations of bread for their family and coffee and things like that. So with this poverty, you're going to have what becomes known as Hoovervilles. So Herbert Hoover at the time was president, and being the president when something of this magnitude occurs, it really becomes easy for much of the population to actually blame the president for the ills that are occurring. And what happens is you get a number of these homeless people coming together in public areas, in public land, across some of these cities and across the country, and basically making makeshift towns. They're called shanty towns, popping up all over these places, with basically building with whatever materials that they can kind of scavenge and to create these towns. And these areas, these Hoovervilles, really were not necessarily good places. A lot of times there was crime, violence in certain cases too. They just were, it just was not necessarily a good place to be, obviously, and definitely not to raise a family or anything like that. This is another great picture that kind of just helps to illustrate, what's going on during the Great Depression, and I think it's really, really cool. It says, "I know three trades, I speak three languages, I fought for 3 years," referring to World War I. I have three children, I've had no work for 3 months, but I only want one job. He's just basically, pleading with anyone reading the sign, if they can help him out, to help him out, because that's how hard pressed he, was. And One thing that really also needs to be mentioned about this time period is that Americans, I mean, heck, even still today, just really don't like taking help from people. I think taking help because you need it in certain cases, people kind of equate that with not being, strong, or not being able to support their family, or things like that, and it's sort of humiliating and sort of embarrassing. So, this kind of speaks volumes on some level about this person, the fact that he's even willing to put this out there, and kind of show that shame, because in some cases he's going to have to do what he can do to get by, right? This is another great photograph. You have one of these bread lines, and you have, it's mostly a minority population there on the bottom. You do have that one boy on the bottom left there, but it's stark contrast to the billboard behind it, right? You have this billboard, you have this classic American family, where you have, the husband, the wife, and the kids packed up in the car. They're all smiling. You have the dog sticking his head out the window, and there's this, the sign that basically says, "There's no way like the American way," right? This is the prosperity and the great thing about being an American. But you have the harsh reality underneath the sign of these people waiting for their food because they just simply have no other options. There's nothing else that they can do. They've tried to find work. Some cases they just absolutely can't, and it's a really sad time period and a really hard time period for much of the Depression for most people. This photograph is just actually one of these Hoovervilles, one of these shanty towns. I believe this is outside of actually Seattle in Washington, but there is a number of Hoovervilles all over the place. One in particular, local to here anyway, is actually in Central Park. The Great Reservoir, actually today in Central Park, was actually once a shanty town as well. Here is just another kind of close-up image of kind of a shanty town and what some of these little shanties were actually constructed of. As far as being president during the Great Depression, at the start of it anyway, Herbert Hoover was arguably hesitant to act on the Depression. Hoover himself actually really stressed the idea of volunteerism and ultimately the role of the individual, and he really felt that things like charities, churches, local governments, and things could really kind of patch things over and could really hold out until this economic crisis was over. Though, on top of that, he did really spur a good amount of government action himself as well. He authorized a number of public works projects to help employ people and get people, making money while working, obviously. He brought in big businessmen, attempting to kind of convince them to keep, hold on to their workers, to not make this, crisis worse. He funded, federal highway projects and dams and parks and libraries and things like that, in an attempt to kind of to help, provide some sort of relief to this depression. I think one of the big things why he gets a bad name as far as, his hesitancy to act in comparison to maybe FDR, coming up here shortly, is that he was a lot more about, maintaining a balanced budget. So as a result, he wasn't necessarily willing to, to create a very large deficit, for some of these programs to provide relief. And one of the actions that Hoover actually, pushes and does is the use of tariffs. And, the belief in, placing tariffs on foreign goods coming into the country, it's going to actually, increase the amount of reliance on American goods and, not on the goods coming in from the other countries, and people are going to buy American, kind of helping to spur the economy. But actually, when he did this, the global community on some level followed suit and actually placed tariffs on American products. So on some level, it actually just kind of helped make things worse and actually shrank the worldwide trade a bit. Another reason why Herbert Hoover gets a bad name is kind of the response to what is called the bonus army. And what the bonus army is that essentially you had a number of World War I veterans who had been promised a stipend, about $1,000 bonus that would actually come to fruition in 1945. Obviously, we're a good way away from 1945 in the early 1930s, and ultimately, the veterans really wanted to start getting that money, right? They were hurting now, and they felt that they should be and were entitled to this money, and actually marched on Washington, D.C. You're going to have about 20,000 marching on D.C., and during this initial push of this bonus army of these veterans, and about 2,000 are going to actually remain when they get turned down for these bonuses, in protest. And you're going to, on some level, get camps that sort of resembled some of the Occupy Wall Street movement camps that we had seen just a few years ago. And ultimately, the army is going to be called in to disband this group and ultimately destroy and get rid of this camp. And this army was actually led by a man named Douglas MacArthur, who is going to become a big name general in World War II. And actually, Eisenhower, I believe, was actually also part of this breaking up of the bonus army. But after this, many of the people in America are going to kind of just, again, start to give Hoover a bit of a bad name and really feel that he's kind of lost touch with the reality of, what many of the Americans were facing, and, in particular the veterans that he, dealt with this way. And it's going to really pave the way for the discontent with Hoover and ultimately the rise of the next person who's going to become president, who is FDR. I do want to just kind of elaborate one more second about Eisenhower being part of this bonus army. Supposedly he was really just a minor aide in this at this point, and he actually didn't necessarily believe in this, and the kind of breaking up and disbanding of the camp and kind of going after the veterans in the capacity that they did. But being the underling here on some level to MacArthur, he actually did write the report kind of endorsing the behavior publicly, even if he didn't necessarily believe in it privately. Here is a photograph of the number of the veterans in Washington, D.C. You can, see them with their signs, New Mexico Division, the North Carolina Division, and basically all of these people that were, here looking for their bonuses at Washington, D.C. So, time to move into the next phase of the Great Depression a little bit, and dealing with and talking about the incoming president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, or he is commonly referred to as. He was actually the former governor of New York State, and he is going to become the Democratic candidate in 1932. He's going to win the election against Herbert Hoover, and just an interesting tidbit about FDR is that he was actually paralyzed from the waist down due to polio. And it's really interesting because this is a time before television, so people didn't necessarily interact with the president back then, and these big time politicians in the way they do today. And you wonder if someone who had been paralyzed like this today would be able to kind of get the attention and the support that he had back then. But the media actually played along on some level. They actually didn't, no one really exposed him for not being able to walk. It wasn't really just a big deal. No one really saw it as a big deal, and most of the American public actually didn't even necessarily realize that he was. In any pictures, he was sitting down behind desks, and essentially you couldn't see that he couldn't walk. So when FDR is elected, he is going to embark on a very serious undertaking in his first 100 days in passing legislature that's going to be an attempt to kind of provide relief and recovery and things to the American public. And one of the first things he does is considered this like persistent experimentation, right? He's going to, have creative ideas and how to handle and potentially experiment in fixing and helping the economy. And one of the first things that's passed is an attempt to kind of to wrangle in the banking system, which was still quite a bit in disarray, and he passes the Emergency Banking Relief Act. And what this does is essentially it's going to give a bit of wide-reaching and wide range of powers to the president over banks. He's going to be able to kind of open and close and reorganize banks that he felt were not necessarily able to help anymore, or were good. And he announced this in what's called a fireside chat. And one of the reasons why he's able to gain a lot of support publicly is the way he interacts with the American public. For the first time, you have a real regular president kind of interacting with the American people and talking directly to the American people, and in what's called these fireside chats, where his public radio addresses to them. And he has this first one on the banking crisis, and talks about to the American public, basically believing them all to understand the issue if it was explained to them properly, and basically explains why they are doing what they're doing. And this is very well received, and you're going to have a number of these fireside chats throughout the course of his presidency. The optimism that FDR came into Congress and came into the presidency with ultimately allowed Congress to pass a ton of legislation in his first 100 days as the president, and much of this legislation is going to become what is known as the New Deal. And these are a number of different laws that affect the banking industry, the stock market, just industrial parts of this country, agriculture, public works, relief for the poor, and ultimately conservation projects and things like that in America. And you're going to have a number of these organizations that are going to be really working to and helping employ a number of the American public for sure. And much of these agencies that come to fruition during the New Deal and out of this are basically providing what becomes known as the 3 R's. It's relief, recovery, and reform. And much of these programs are giving many needy people, people that are really struggling, in many cases government jobs, and all of these agencies are going to kind of become abbreviated, and they're going to become known as alphabet agencies. For example, you're going to have the Civilian Conservation Corps, which is going to become just the CCC, and this was essentially providing jobs for young men to work in conservation, planting trees and working in parks, building bridges, and things like this, public work, to help these young men basically get a foothold and make some money, and in some cases send money back to their families. Another big one, and this is a very controversial one actually, is the Tennessee Valley Authority, or the TVA. And what the TVA did was basically build dams in the southern states, in Appalachia, in the Appalachian Mountains down in the southern states, in particular like Tennessee and Georgia, and the Tennessee Valley in particular, obviously. And these dams were providing electricity. And the reason why this is a big deal and why there was a lot of pushback against this is kind of seen as an expansion of government power and getting involved in private practice in certain cases, right? The government, by providing this electricity through these dams, this becomes a major area of contention, with people saying that they are competing against, your individuals who were providing electricity to these people, and basically utilizing the government resources that basically the average person couldn't compete against them. You're going to have the FERA, or the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, which is going to really work to kind of just help give relief to the unemployed and people that were really, struggling. Additionally, you're going to have the AAA, which is the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, which is going to actually pay farmers to not grow certain crops. And the reason for this is that by not growing certain crops, it's going to actually decrease the supply of these crops, and as a result, typically with the decrease in supply, you're going to have prices actually go up, and other farmers, are going to actually be able to make, a little bit more solid of an income. Was the thought behind that. You're also going to have the NRA, and this is not the National Rifle Administration, but this is actually the National Recovery Administration, which is going to actually kind of set standards for production in the industry, in industrial output of this country in certain areas, prices on things and wages on things. It's really an attempt to kind of regulate the industry in this country. You're going to have the Public Works Administration as well, which is really important. The Public Works Administration is just, again, public works projects, things like building ports, schools, aircraft carriers, dams, you name it, big public works jobs that are employing people and obviously paying them for it. The FDIC, which is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which is what we were talking about just before, is going to insure the savings accounts in banks with government money to basically prevent bank runs and not allow that kind of thing to actually, work out anymore. One worth noting is the Rural Electrification Administration. It's going to basically try to get electricity to rural areas where it can help them. The WPA, which is the Works Project Progress Administration, employs men and women, again, building hospitals, parks, just another big public work projects. The Social Security Act is arguably one of the biggest legacies of the New Deal. And this is, sets up this system of a federal pension, really, for the elderly, unemployed, when they're getting older, people with disabilities, that people who can't really work and support themselves anymore. You pay into this Social Security your whole life, and by the time you retire, it's going to actually, open up new jobs for the younger people, but also they will not have to work because they can take part of this Social Security. It's ensuring that they are not super impoverished when they are older. Another two more here are the Farm Security Administration, which lends money to sharecroppers, helping migrant workers, and then ultimately the Fair Labor Standards Act, the FLSA here, which is going to actually establish minimum wages and maximum hours, and basically help the labor movement and unions and things like that. So these are all really big, important agencies that were creative on some level, and in some cases it's going to be actually a big fight by FDR and his people to keep these things, because actually some of them are actually going to be shut down by the Supreme Court as the government kind of overreaching and not really being able to do this is unconstitutional. But a number of them do stick and are going to be seriously important for many people in this country. Though one thing that's really important also to note is that these are not necessarily what ends the Great Depression, right? It's funny because even though all of this stuff was going on, it didn't really have a huge impact on the unemployment rate in the country. But it's important to note that the unemployment rate would probably have been drastically larger had it not been for these, and people would have been hurting a whole lot more had it not been for these relief, recovery, and reform agencies. So as I just kind of said, this really is not responsible for ending the Great Depression. But one thing that it did is that it seriously changed the way of thinking in this country. Roosevelt's actually going to use this term liberalist and kind of to refer to a large active state that really is looking out for the security of the average man, and it's going to change expectations of government. When it comes down to it today, we really kind of think of government and expect government to do things, do something, anything at all when things are bad, to help out the people in need. And FDR is going to drastically increase the size and the scope of the government, and it's going to become an institution that directly influences, many Americans' daily lives, and in this case anyway, is directly concerned with their welfare. And this is why, many people saw FDR as an incredibly important president, and one of the reasons why he's actually going to be elected to a third term, and even a fourth term during World War II. but it's also important to say is that his fourth term, he's going to actually die not too long after being elected for the fourth time. One last thing to talk about FDR is his fight to actually increase the size of the Supreme Court. Obviously, he had some issues with the Supreme Court and some of his New Deal initiatives. Many of them were actually struck down as unconstitutional. So one of the things that FDR looked to do was actually add more justices, add more Supreme Court justices that would ultimately, push his agenda and be okay with his agenda and be okay with his rationale and his way of thinking. And this didn't actually ever really come to fruition, but it was one of the things that he did push for, and it just kind of, again, something that many people didn't actually like about him as far as, expanding the government. You have the side that obviously believes that the expansion of the government was a good thing, and the other side that believes government should be continued to be small, which is kind of the age-old debate in American politics ever since the founding. So on that note, thank you for listening, and goodbye.